Good morning, everybody. Super excited to see some great turnout for this program. It's been a couple months coming, planned, and we're excited to give some background on ARPA dollars as it relates to the U.S. Treasury guidelines and on the application that we've put together and request form and some of the other materials that we've referenced in there. So we have Groner here with us today, who's been our consultant since the start of this pandemic. They've supported us all through CARES, the CARES Act funding that we received that I know I've worked with some of you on, and have been with us through this ARPA funding as well. So again, excited that everybody is here with us this morning. And we will be monitoring chat. Patrice and I will be monitoring chat. And if we get a break or a certain a time which makes sense, we may stop the Bronner team from presenting and kind of kicking some of those questions out. And as Alex said, what we're looking for is just some of the programmatic and application specific questions. If you have a specific question about your organization or maybe what you're trying to apply for, we'll have that website up later that you can go to, or I'm sorry, the email address that you can send an email to that we can talk to you kind of separate on those items. But with that, I'll kick it over to Alex Aziri from Bronner to kick us off. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here with you today, online, if not in person. This is a really exciting program, but it is a little more complicated than some of the previous federal funding or federal relief programs that have come through. So it's great to be able to share this with you and to receive some of your questions. And with that, I'll get us kicked off. We have a lot of ground to cover today. So this is the bare bones of what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to start off with a little bit of a history lesson, talking about the American Rescue Plan and how it's structured. Then we're going to talk a little bit about what eligible projects look like, the qualities that that define an eligible project. Then we're going to start talking about evidence and equity and how those two things can be informing your project design and how they'll be informing how you report. Then we'll get into compliance requirements, and then we'll talk a little bit about the application and some of the documents associated with that. To start off with our history lesson, President Joe Biden signed the American Rescue Plan Act into law on March 11, 2021. There are $1.9 trillion in this bill. And this was really designed to build on the CARES Act and help to accelerate the recovery from the harms caused by the pandemic, both the health harms, the harm to public health, and the economic harms, and to increase communities' resilience to similar harms in the future. It's something we'll talk about a little bit later on in the presentation, but that's one of the reasons why there is some emphasis placed on infrastructure as part of this program. And then of that $1.9 trillion, $350 billion were allocated to states, tribes, territories, and local governments by the Coronavirus State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund. And so this is where the money that Lake County is distributing as part of this program is coming from. It's from that $350 billion. And so if you ever see SLFRF, don't be scared. That's just what that means. To get a little bit more in the weeds on ARPA, there are a couple of requirements that have to be met. The funds have many uses, but they are constrained by connections to COVID or economic harms. And these funds are distributed to the recipients via formula by the U.S. Treasury. So this is a U.S. Treasury program. The guidelines and requirements come down to Lake County, which is in this case the recipient, from the U.S. Treasury. And in that box, we have some of the statutory uses. And we're going to discuss those in a little bit in much greater detail. But another thing that's important to mention at this juncture is that there is a very strict timeline for the use of these funds. And so Lake County, which is again the recipient of these funds, must obligate all ARPA funds by December 31st, 2024. And all ARPA funds must be spent by the recipient, which is again Lake County, and the subrecipients, which is the role that you all are applying for, by December 31st, 2026. Any funds that are not spent by these dates, so any funds that are not obligated by 2024 or spent by 2026, must be returned to U.S. Treasury. And so in order to make sure that all of these funds are indeed spent by 2026, Lake County will be embarking on an intensive evaluation of projects funding for projects that receive awards through this program to make sure that all of the funds will be spent by that 2026 deadline. To get into a little more depth on that, the reason for this and the reason that it's being shared with you is not to menace, but to kind of help share the reasoning. This is a great opportunity for Lake County, and it's really important to make sure that all the funds that were awarded by Treasury are used to support Lake County residents and businesses, and to also help inform your project design. To talk a little bit about the evaluation, 5 points are awarded in the evaluation based on how prepared the applicant is to start the project. And so it's really all about making sure that everybody understands that these timelines are really, really important when you're designing your project. So now we can talk a little bit about eligibility. But before we get into that, I think it's really important to talk about Lake County's request guidelines. And so we'll run through these fairly quickly. Some of these are going to be touched on again. One thing that I think is really important to mention, and it's also number one on this list, is that only requests that are eligible for funding under a specific direct ARPA eligibility category will be considered. A common mistake that we see, and it's certainly not the fault of the applicant, but people select more than one eligibility category. Treasury is very clear that you have to be aligned with only one category. These requests are going to be scored based on established criteria, which we're going to talk about at the end of this list. Eligible requesters include nonprofits and local units of government other than municipalities. The physical location of the program or service provided needs to be within the geographic boundaries of Lake County, Illinois. And so this can't be supporting programming or services provided outside of Lake County. Funding will be provided on a reimbursement basis unless a case is established for upfront funds. The minimum request value is $50,000. There is no maximum, but the current max soft allocation is currently $10 million across all programs. And now we'll talk a little bit about how these projects are going to be evaluated. So impact of project versus effort involved. So, basically impact per dollar. Again, how ready an applicant is to start the project. An applicant who is going to need to have 2 to 3 years in order to get ready to start their project is not going to score nearly as well as somebody who can, start day one. Countywide impact. And so how localized is the impact going to be felt, or is it going to be felt by residents of Lake County across the county? How aligned it is with public input. Lake County did a very extensive outreach program in order to get feedback from the communities about how they wanted to see this money spent, and that is available through a link on the application itself. And so finding ways to align your project with public desires will help you score better. Budget detail. It's really important, not just from a compliance standpoint to have a very detailed budget, but also to help us understand the scope of the work that you're trying to do. Fiscal sustainability. So is this a project that is designed in such a way that it will allow it to continue after ARPA funding is used? Leveraged funds. So have you been able to find other sources of financing for this project, or is ARPA the only source of funding for this project? Performance tracking. This is something that we'll talk a little bit more about as we're reviewing the application itself. But tracking performance, tracking how those dollars are used and how it's producing results is very, very important to Treasury. And so those interests flow down to the county. Equity components, again, something that we're going to talk more about. But equity is also very important. Many of you will know that the pandemic disproportionately impacted many communities that have been historically disinvested. And so trying to produce or supporting programs that produce more equitable outcomes is something that's really important to the Treasury. Evidence basis for methodology. So programs that have strong basis of evidence that support the use of those methods are going to score better. And then risk, high risk projects that don't seem as if they'll be completed or present a more significant risk from a compliance standpoint will score more poorly. And so
Alex,
yes,
sorry, we did get one question there, and it was one I was kind of expecting actually. For the $10 million per request, there's no maximum on the request value, but at the same time, there has been really not a lot of discussion at the committee level yet, at the board level, as to how much money they want to put forward towards the external applications. Right now, what staff recommended to the committee was $10 million across all the programs that were submitted. So it's the Lake County based requests combined for the 10 million. But the reason the word soft is in there is because I think it may be also a discussion that will be worth having based on the requests that we get and how much that total combined dollar value is.
Awesome. Thank you, Matt. Great question.
Alex, I'm going to jump in. There's a couple more that I think is important to clarify at this point. The question came in, can we only apply for one category per application? Can you just cover that again for us, please?
Yes, and it's something that I'm really going to hit hard during this presentation. But if your project is focusing on multiple interventions to serve different populations, so different uses of funds to serve different beneficiaries, you should split them up along those lines and submit multiple applications. And this is, again, because Treasury requires that each project be aligned, be specifically linked to a specific expenditure category, because that has a direct impact on how these projects are reported on.
I just want to throw one more out to you at this time, and then we'll address some of the other questions after you get through a few more slides, because I think some of your slides kind of help to address this. But there's just a request for clarification of the phrase, all requests that require revenue replacement dollars will not be scored or considered. Revenue replacement means a lot to me because I'm very in line with this program, but I know that some of our viewers probably are less familiar with revenue replacement is. So can you maybe just clarify that just a bit?
Yes, and so revenue replacement is a group of expenditure categories, and this is money that was awarded specifically to the state and local governments based on revenue that was lost during the pandemic because of the pandemic. And so any tax revenue that wasn't collected that was lost, basically any other revenue streams that were foregone because basically the country was in the middle of a crisis. There was a formula that was issued by Treasury, and so these municipalities, counties, and metro cities could either take $10 million or whatever number of dollars they arrived at using that formula. The revenue replacement dollars are unique because the ways in which they can be used are significantly greater than other types of expenditure categories, and the reporting is much reduced.
Great, thank you very much. Just so you know, there's a bunch of questions kind of flying in about the end date and such, but I'm going to let you go forward with a few more slides, and then we'll break in again and make sure that we've got all these questions covered.
Sounds great.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. And so as I mentioned before, and as we just addressed in the questions, each project needs to be aligned with a single expenditure category. There are 83 of these expenditure categories that fall into 7 specific groups. And then something else that's important to talk about at this juncture, and that we'll come back to in a few slides, is for each expenditure category, Treasury has listed certain permitted uses. These all are called enumerated uses, and they are more likely to be presumed eligible than uses that are not listed by Treasury, that are not enumerated. And again, just because I think it's really important to recognize this, if you do have projects that are serving different groups of beneficiaries with different uses of ARPA funds, you're better off separating those projects into two separate projects and then submitting them separately. These are the types of expenditures that are related to the expenditure categories that Lake County will be funding projects from for this round. And so public health, the types of expenditures that are permitted are COVID-19 mitigation and prevention, community violence interventions, and behavioral health interventions. Number two, that's expenditure category 2, is assistance to households, assistance to small businesses, assistance to nonprofits, and then A2, impacted industries. And then there's number 5, and this kind of goes back into the community resilience component that I mentioned earlier, but that's infrastructure, so water and sewer and broadband. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about program design and how that affects your eligibility and the risk that the project might not be eligible. And so given how varied COVID-19 impacts were on different communities, Treasury really wanted to provide recipients with the greatest possible flexibility when supporting projects. But they did create certain very specific, well, I shouldn't say specific guidelines, but they did provide guidelines for recipients like Lake County to identify which projects are more likely to be eligible and which are less likely to be eligible. And so, as I mentioned before, Treasury does list some uses of ARPA funds in Final Rule, which is the document that governs the use of ARPA funds. These are called enumerated uses. And then Treasury also lists groups of people who are presumed to be eligible to receive the programs and services that are paid for by ARPA funds, and those are called enumerated beneficiaries. And so when both the beneficiary and the use of funds are enumerated, the project is presumed to be an eligible use of funds. And so to refer to our diagram, that would be in the bottom left of the square. That would be considered a low risk project because is considered less likely to be an ineligible use of funds. And all this is to say that ARPA fund or uses of ARPA funds and beneficiaries that are not included in the Final Rule are not presumed to be ineligible, but they are more likely to be non-compliant. And so Treasury provides us with an eligibility test. So there are
Alex, sorry. There's just a couple questions, and then there was one that I just wanted to make sure we covered while you were on that previous slide. So just to hit a couple, are multi-year funding requests allowable? Yes, and we'll talk about that when we get into the application. Is it $10 million annually or total? Right now it's total across all of the years and the requests that we received. If we receive PPP, are we ineligible to apply? Alex, do you want to hit that one? I think the answer is no, but we also can't duplicate fund use.
Yeah, and that would be the point that I would want to make there is that you are eligible to receive ARPA funds if you did receive PPP funds, but you can't double count basically.
Right.
And so they have to be separate projects.
Okay, and then there's some questions on categories. Are the categories prioritized? Are we allocating a certain amount per category? We're not, and you can certainly apply for a program in any of the categories, but the one thing to keep in mind is that there is some prioritization based on the public input that we received as that is a scoring category. So one of the scoring criteria that the application will be reviewed against. So but other than that, there's from a programmatic standpoint, there's no we're not going into this thinking that we're going to break that 10 right now, the 10 million up in based on certain category amount. And then the question I wanted to get to was, can you clarify what you mean by enumerated?
Certainly. And so to provide a little bit more context, a lot of the things that we're sharing with you all here today are talked about in Treasury's final rule. And basically, this is a 400-page document issued by Treasury, which basically provides all the guidelines that you will need to follow in order to administer this program. And so as they're going through the different eligible uses of funds, they do list some eligible uses. And so an example of an eligible use would be paying for vaccinations. An example of an eligible use would be providing people with behavioral health services. An eligible use would be providing technical assistance to nonprofits. And we call them enumerated uses because they are specifically spelled out. They're specifically mentioned in the text of the final rule.
Thanks, Alex. I know that you have some examples coming up, but I just wanted to feed you a couple of questions in advance so that you can kind of work them into the slides. The economic impact category, especially as it relates to nonprofits, could they actually get their revenues if they were impacted by the pandemic? Would they be able to receive general operating income? And secondly, is direct assistance such as food, rental assistance, et cetera, eligible under category 2? So I know that you're going to continue with some slides that go through each one of these in greater detail, but I just wanted to throw those out. And then we'll let you go for a few more slides and then address some more questions.
Sounds great. Yeah, those are both really good questions. And when we get to the example slide, I'd be happy to speak directly to them. For expenditure categories 1, 2, and 3, there are different eligibility tests applied. And so it's really a 3-tiered test. There's a 2-part eligibility test, and then there's a blanket application of a 3rd standard. So the first important component is that the proposed intervention, the proposed project, is responding to a pandemic-related harm. The second component is the proposed project benefits an impacted group. And so this impacted group would be the beneficiary. I'm just going to keep dropping those terms in because they're important when you're working in this program. And then in all cases, the program response must be reasonably proportional. And by reasonably proportional, I mean that the scale of the response is proportional to the harm experienced by the beneficiary. And so to get into the example really quick, I'm proposing a project to provide relief to impacted small business owners. And what I would like to do is provide them with funds to offset their costs in making their businesses COVID-19 safe. And so they had to, replace some old HVAC units. They had to, put up some of those plexiglass barriers. And so this is an example of an eligible project and a response that is reasonably proportional. An example of a response that would not be reasonably proportional in this case would be if my proposal was to tear down their business and build a new business that met COVID-19 best practices. And so, as I mentioned, there's a different eligibility standard for infrastructure projects. Number 1, the investment must be considered necessary to provide an adequate minimum level of service. And you'll notice that necessary is in quotations. A good shorthand for necessary as far as the final rule is concerned is projects that are enumerated in the Clean Water State Revolving Fund and the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund are presumed to be necessary by Treasury. And so that's one way of responding to that test. And then the investment must be unlikely to be made using a private source of funds. And so to give another example, if you wanted to put up last mile fiber in your community, but say somebody like AT&T was already doing that, and they're already in the process of doing that, that would be an ineligible use of funds. There's already investment going into that project, and the federal government is not interested in competing with the telecoms companies. And so to get into another example, I'm proposing to have lead water pipes replaced in small businesses and residences. So this is actually a use of funds that is enumerated in Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, and so it's reasonable and proportional and considered necessary. An example of a project that would be considered ineligible would be if I wanted to run sewer and water through a greenfield, basically, with the expectation that eventually it might be the population of my community might grow, and that might eventually get turned into a subdivision. So you can't be funding projects that are projecting future growth. And then this is just an overview of all of the different expenditure categories in each of the groups. And so this is group one. I'm not going to go super into depth because there are a lot of them. I will touch on a few though. One thing I did want to call out for your attention though is the stars and the little carrots that are next to some of these expenditure categories. Those are going to be relevant when we start talking about evidence and equity. So I just want to point them out now. And so these are all of the public health expenditure categories. You'll notice that 1.8 and 1.9 are COVID-19 assistance to small businesses and to nonprofits. This is distinct from the expenditure categories in group two. This is specifically for impact or mitigating the impact of, or not mitigating the impact of COVID-19, but COVID-19 mitigation investments in those businesses. And so here is expenditure category two. And so to the earlier question about providing, I think it was food and rent, is that?
Yep, it was direct assistance in the form of food or rental, for example.
Yes, and so those are both enumerated uses of funds. Again, reasonably proportional does apply here, and so you can't be cutting $50,000 checks to people. But yes, those are both enumerated uses. The other key factor there is that it's important that a pandemic harm is documented. Again, especially with categories 1 and 2, with groups 1 and 2, excuse me, these are responses to pandemic harms. And so if you are seeking to serve a population, beneficiaries must be able to document those pandemic harms either through evidence or an attestation. And these are group 2 continuing.
As you're scrolling through those, Alex, we've gotten a question as to whether people would be able to directly access the U.S. Treasury's 400-page document, kind of giving more information about this. And certainly that is publicly available information, correct?
It is. Treasury has a very helpful SLFRF webpage that includes not just the final rule, but it also includes an FAQ and an overview and a compliance and reporting guide. I would recommend starting with the overview just because it's a little more digestible, and it does touch on a lot of the most important points of the final rule. But if you really want to get into the weeds, all of that information is there.
I'm going to just throw out a couple of other ones here, Alex. When mentioning that it can only apply to one category, does that mean the larger group, such as public health, negative economic impact, or the smaller categories like 2.2 and 2.16?
That's a great question. Yeah, so the smaller expenditure categories. And so like, for example, if I wanted to invest in centralized wastewater treatment, I put it as 5.1. but not like just group 5 in general. I think that answers the question.
Yeah, exactly. It does have to be specifically only one of the categories, like specific 5.9, 5.10. While you're still on this slide, there's a question, are capital expenditures allowed?
Certainly, yes. Capital expenditures are permitted. Like the other uses, some capital expenditures are enumerated, but in all cases, Treasury requires additional reporting if the expenditure is greater than $1 million. And then there are certain capital expenditures that are expressly forbidden, like road work and large economic development projects.
Great. All right. We've got a lot of questions, even some requests to even scroll back, but we're going to keep moving forward and try to leave some more room for questions at the end. So why don't you press forward, Alex?
And I'll just add that we'll make sure this presentation is available on the website afterwards. I think that was one question. So
beautiful. All righty, pushing forward. Here's a continuation of expenditure 5, and you'll notice that those expenditure categories do map pretty closely to DWSRF and CWSRF. Moving forward, in order to help subrecipients and recipients identify which uses of funds are considered reasonably proportional, Treasury does break a lot of these beneficiaries for expenditure categories, expenditure groups 1 and 2 into 2 groups. These are impacted classes and disproportionately impacted classes. And so, as I was mentioning before, Treasury recognizes that individuals and entities living in areas that have been historically disinvested experience much more severe impacts as a result of COVID-19. And so the amount of support, the harm experienced was greater, and so the amount of support that can be received by those beneficiaries is greater. So just to run through some examples, assistance to households, which would include the food assistance and rental assistance, that would include households that experience unemployment, households that experienced increased food or housing insecurity. There are certain federal programs that are used, or which participants are presumed to be eligible. And then this also applies to expenditure 2. So small businesses that experience a negative economic impact are considered impacted by the pandemic, and so they are eligible for support through the second expenditure category group. And then also assistance to households. Again, I wanted to call out households that are in disproportionately or in qualified census tracts are considered disproportionately impacted, as are households that are receiving services provided by tribal governments. And we'll talk more about qualified census tracts when we get into the application itself. And so here are some of the more of the disproportionately impacted classes. Again, qualified census tracts and businesses on tribal lands are identified as being disproportionately impacted. That's a shorthand used by Treasury, and the same would apply to nonprofits. And now we'll get into our examples. And so again, we're gonna go back to that 3-part test that we were talking about before. An ambulance would be considered eligible, but a fire truck would not be considered eligible because the fire truck is not responding to a pandemic harm, whereas an ambulance would be. You know, a lot of emergency services providers were under a lot more strain as a result of the pandemic. Many still are. They experienced significant increases in calls, and so just having another ambulance helped them to reduce response times and you know, better respond to the pandemic. providing beneficiaries with a bus fare stipend. That is an enumerated use in certain cases because Treasury recognizes that people need help, unemployed people need help getting to job interviews, to trainings, to work sites, whereas buying beneficiaries a new car, that would not be an eligible use because that is not considered proportional to the harm experienced. And then lastly, going back to our small businesses, providing assistance to a business incorporated in June 1st, 2019 would be eligible, whereas a business that was just incorporated in June 1st, 2022 would not be considered eligible because Treasury presumes that the business incorporated in 2022 did not experience an economic harm as a result of the pandemic, because it was created after the pandemic had peaked, basically. All right, having covered eligibility and those requirements, we can talk a little bit about evidence and equity. And so you'll remember that I called out those stars and carrots when we were looking at the different expenditure categories. Treasury recognizes that there are bodies of evidence related to responses to some pandemic harm, and Treasury requires that managers of these types of projects report on whether their intervention is evidence-based. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about what the standards for something to be considered evidence-based are, but there are certain expectations that projects will report on how their project was developed during the reporting process. And for the carrots, Treasury also recognizes that the pandemic disproportionately impacted some communities, especially historically disinvested communities. And Treasury requires that managers of these types of projects report on whether and how their intervention supports impacted or disproportionately impacted populations. And so again, expenditure categories where you have to report on whether or not it's an evidence-based project are marked with a star, and projects that are marked with the caret indicate that you need to report on whether and how this intervention is supporting impacted or disproportionately impacted populations. So this is an overview of what Treasury considers evidence. In order for a project to be considered evidence-based, it has to be either supported by strong evidence, which allows evaluators to draw conclusions about the impact of the proposed project with a high degree of confidence. And this would be through one or more well-designed and well-implemented experimental studies, whereas moderate evidence, it allows the evaluator to draw conclusions about the impact of the proposed project with moderate confidence. So this could be through one or more quasi-experimental studies or two or more non-experimental studies. And then lastly, preliminary evidence, which again, if the project is based on preliminary evidence, Treasury does not qualify that as being an evidence-based project. This is just substantiated by a one or more non-experimental studies. And here are some resources that you can use in order to find some studies that meet those research requirements and those implementation requirements. And these links are also in the application form as well. Oh, and a few more. And now we can talk about the equity guidance that Treasury has provided. As I've mentioned, Treasury has placed a lot of import on ensuring that ARPA programs or programs funded by ARPA funds promote equitable outcomes in communities. And so they supplied these questions for applicants to think about as they're designing their projects, basically making sure that the goals of the project are aligned with Treasury's, that these project administrators and managers are thinking about what are the best ways to reaching the people who might benefit from these projects the most. And now we can talk a little bit about compliance requirements. As I mentioned at the top, the compliance requirements are a little more complex than they were for the CARES Act or some of the other federal relief dollars that were distributed earlier on in the pandemic. And so I'm glad we get to talk about these a little bit. To start off with, ARPA requires that all recipients manage funds in accordance with Universal Grant Guidance, which is 2 CFR 200. And we'll talk about a few components of Universal Grant Guidance. But basically, this is a document that's issued by OMB, Office of Management and Budget, to ensure that, or to create consistent rules and regulations across government programs. And to really understand compliance and what requirements are going to be expected of you and of your subrecipients and contractors, I'd like to kind of define some of the roles in this process. And so, as I've already mentioned, Lake County is considered the recipient of the funds. They were awarded these funds by Treasury. So in this case, Treasury would be the awarding agency. And then everybody who is receiving funds to carry out a project on behalf of the recipient, in this case, Lake County, would be considered a subrecipient. And then all of the individuals that benefit from those projects are beneficiaries. And so while beneficiaries have to meet certain thresholds in order to be eligible to receive funds, the compliance requirements in Universal Grant Guidance will not apply to them. And so you don't have to be monitoring them in the same way that you will need to be monitoring any subrecipients that you have. And so many of these uniform grant guidance regulations are tied to the funds themselves. And so they will apply to all entities that receive the funds, which in many cases is subrecipients. But some of these flow down requirements, some of these requirements also include contractors. And Lake County is the recipient of these funds. And so it is incumbent upon them to monitor subrecipients to ensure that these general guidelines are being followed. It's also important to mention that entities that receive more than $750,000 in federal funding, and that's not just through an award from Lake County, that's in general, are subject to the Single Audit Act. But ARPA funds are not subject to the Cash Management Improvement Act, and so these funds can be placed in interest-bearing accounts. One part of uniform guidance that we are going to talk about, because it is very important and it's something that most of you will probably have to contend with, is the procurement guidelines. As you can see here, it is broken out by the size of the purchase. And so purchases that are under $250,000 are considered informal purchases, and the requirements around informal purchases are much less significant. However, and so for micro purchases, you should be sure to get some quotes or do research to determine the reasonableness of the costs that you are incurring. And then for small purchases, you should be sure to get some quotes from an adequate number of qualified sources. It's something that we'll talk a little bit about at the end of this component of the presentation, but documenting your procurement process and all your internal control processes are very, very important. And that it does, again, include procurement. If your expenditure is going to be greater than $250,000, this becomes a formal procurement. And two of the things that apply to both types of formal procurement, these procedures must be documented, and they must be advertised. So this must be a public process. And so there are two formal procurement methods available to you. There's a sealed bids process, and you know, when you are issuing or a request for sealed bids, it must include complete, adequate, and realistic specifications. You must provide sufficient response time, and in order for it to be valid, you must receive responses from 2 or more responsible bidders, and it must be awarded to the lowest responsive and responsible bidder. For a fixed price or cost reimbursement contract, these requests for proposals must be publicized, and they must identify all evaluation factors and their relative importance. They must have a written method for technical evaluations, and contracts must be awarded to the responsible offerer whose proposal is most advantageous to the entity that issued the RFP. Of course, there are some exceptions to this, to the formal and informal procurement. You can go for a non-competitive procurement if one or more of the following circumstances apply. If you're below the micro purchase threshold, if the good that you are seeking is only available from a single source. And so, for example, if I was seeking out reusable rockets, I could go for a non-competitive procurement because only SpaceX offers reusable rockets. If public exigency or emergency for the requirement will not permit a delay resulting from publicizing a competitive solicitation. And so if something absolutely has to be purchased now, you can forego the formal procurement process. In this case, the COVID-19 pandemic does not qualify. You can also forego the formal procurement process if permitted by the federal awarding agency or Lake County, or after solicitation of a number of sources, competition is determined to be inadequate. And so here are some compliance best practices. Put everything in writing. Documentation is your best friend. You should have written standards of conduct for contractors. You should set control activities based on levels of risk. You should make sure that you are monitoring subrecipients and contractors on an ongoing basis. And you should be ensuring that you are maintaining and retaining the appropriate records, because the Office of Inspector General may request records through 2031. And now some important dates. So applications opened up on September 30th. They can be found there at that link. And the printed applications and questions as well may be submitted at Arpa Lake Co at Lake County, Illinois, or lakecountyil.gov. And applications must be submitted by October 31st, 2022.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Alex. I do want to make sure that we leave time to go through the actual application. So we're not going to be able to get to all of these questions, but there's a few high-level questions that I'd like to just throw out there. The first is direct versus indirect services. You know, there's a couple of questions about whether indirect services that provide assistance to other entities that provide direct services, you know, would it be best to just ask people to kind of read through the eligible categories, and if they believe that their service or their program meets those requirements, you know, they'd be eligible to apply, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that'd be the best course of action there.
And then pandemic harm, you know, we've actually talked about this a lot, and as we get further and further away from the actual height of the COVID-19 pandemic, you know, proving that pandemic harm is challenging. So can you just speak to pandemic harm in general, and then specifically as it relates to mental health?
Okay, so for mental health, it's actually much easier because Treasury presumes that the general public was impacted by COVID-19, and so all are potential beneficiaries for behavioral health services. And I think that that is a harm that could be established for longer than some of the other uses of ARPA funds may be.
Great. Okay, so a couple questions for you, Matt. Can projects that were completed prior to this process be reimbursed?
Yeah, so the intent of the program is to look forward at new programs to support Lake County. So, and you can see based on the complexity of the requirements here, we're not considering just based on how much is involved. We're not considering projects that have already been completed. And so in that regard, no, we are not looking forward to reimburse for projects that have already been expensed.
And then as you're kind of going through the application, which I know you're about to do, can you kind of speak to the scoring breakdown and the number of points in each category, and then whether organizations can apply for this grant together and whether a 501c3 is required? So those are types of things that are coming in that maybe you can throw in as you're kind of walking through the application.
Yes, certainly. I'm going to stop sharing my screen very quick.
While you're doing that, Alex, one question that I assumed that we would get is when are the announcements going to be made with respect to what's awarded? And I did get that question already emailed to us, and it's dependent on how many applications we get. Obviously, we have a huge turnout here, which is excellent. So I'm assuming that we're going to get a number of applications. We're going to have time to review those and score them and get an opportunity to present to the county board for their decision making as to what's going to be awarded. I would expect, just based on all the things that are occurring in Lake County right now in the upcoming election, that may not be until sometime in early or at least January of 23 when that discussion occurs and decisions are made. And with that, Alex, I will turn it back to you.
All right, sorry, let me just share my screen again. All right. So as far as the beginning of the application, asking just for general information about the organization and the scope of the project. So requester here would be the organization that is seeking the funds. The contact person would be the best person to get in touch with if we had follow-up questions. Project title, funding request, all fairly straightforward. Estimated start date and end date are very critical. Please do not have an estimated end date after December 31st, 2026. And as we mentioned before, the sooner the project can start, the better. These are the request guidelines that we've discussed. So number one, right at the top, please select only one eligible expense category, or only one eligible expense category for your project, and then provide a description of the proposed program or the investment. And again, please don't overlook the beneficiaries who are going to be receiving these services as well, because that is a really important part of the evaluation. Again, pandemic harm is, again, really important to understanding whether or not a project is an eligible use of funds, and providing some supporting information so that we really understand, is this a project that is well documented, and is the response reasonably proportional? And so all of this, partnering with entities to deliver this program. And so I believe that touches on that. I think a single applicant is required. However, partnerships are welcomed. And then looking at the cost reasonableness of the project. And so this goes back to uniform guidance regulations and making sure that federal dollars are not being used wastefully. Looking at budget and finance, this is really, really important. And so there is a separate budget document as well, so you can provide greater detail, but this is to provide us with an overview of how funds will be used over the life of the project. One thing that I would highlight, because it's been a challenge with other applications, is making sure that the costs on both documents are aligned. And really making sure that we understand any budget uncertainties or potential unknowns. This is really important because Treasury is particular about how budgets are changed. And so if you do change your budget, please be sure to let us know. And especially with inflation being what it is now, it's really important that that channel of communication is open. Any associated costs that would not be covered by ARPA, or would there be ongoing costs beyond ARPA? And so this speaks to the fiscal sustainability of the project and countywide impact. This would speak to, how broad is the impact going to be felt? Is this going to be a very localized project, or is it something that's going to be serving the entire county? And this is another way of quantifying that. This question is looking for information about how the project is aligned with the county's public engagement information. And so I have that document pulled up here. Oops. Right here. And so this provides, good overview of different types of projects that Lake County residents were interested in. For infrastructure projects, labor practices are very important. And so it'll be important that those projects are consistent with Treasury guidelines. Community engagement. It is important that projects are serving an identified need, and that the county can be reasonably sure that there's going to be demand for these services. Equitable outcomes, which we spoke about at some length, really trying to make sure that the expenditure categories, especially with the caret after it, address how these historically underserved, marginalized, or adversely affected groups are going to be served. Here it talks about service area, which is really important for making sure that it is understood where these services are going to be delivered and who is going to be benefiting from them. And this really ties back to eligibility in a lot of respects, because as we talked about before, only certain interventions are permitted for disproportionately impacted groups. And so I have pulled up, for example, the map of the qualified census tracts in Lake County. And so if you were trying to offer services in one of the purple areas, you would have more latitude when identifying which services you are going to be offering beneficiaries there. This goes back to evidence-based practices. Again, you're encouraged to fill it out, but it is required if the expenditure category that you're aligned with has a star after it. So please make sure that you refer to these research databases and then include that information here. This is also really, really important, which is to say Treasury is very interested to know about the progress that is being driven by each of these projects. And so really identifying KPIs that capture what your goals are, what the objectives of the project are. And so these KPIs, they should be quantifiable, they should be achievable, they should be measurable, and they should really be relevant to what you are trying to do. To go back to our earlier example with the ambulance, one of the performance measures could be response time. And so the current outcome could be, it takes them 6 minutes currently to respond to calls. And then, with an additional ambulance, you could say, we hope for our response time to be 4 minutes. You could say that we'd like to serve 100 more people per year. We'd like to respond to more calls. All those things would be relevant in those cases. This is important. Again, monitoring is really critical to ensuring that Treasury is satisfied with the information that it's receiving. And so please be sure to make sure that you are tracking who is benefiting and how they're benefiting. This is something, program administration, that we touched on briefly before. There are not insignificant requirements for the administration of these programs. And so please let us know, how you are going to undertake this process. Has this or will this expense be submitted for reimbursement through another federal or state relief program? Is a question that was already asked or touched upon. Lake County cannot double count federal funds. And so if this project is already being funded by another federal funding stream, please let us know. And here is the appendix with all of the expenditure categories.
That's awesome, Alex. Thank you so much for the overview of the application and all of the great information that you've shared with us today. I want to remind all of you that this entire presentation will be available on our website, and we will also make the slides available. We are over the hour that we had hoped for, but there are some important questions that I just want to make sure that we kind of touch back on again to really clarify. I just want to speak again to the $10 million. Is there a cap, Matt, to the amount that individual applicants can apply for?
We never set a cap. It was a cap on the program in its entirety. The only one that we put a condition around was the minimum. So the minimum amount that you should request is $50,000 for your program. But there is a soft cap overall for all programs right now of 10 million.
And a question has been asked, they're aware that we were given 135 million as Lake County. And so the amount right now that has been allocated for this external process is the $10 million of that overall 135 million. Is that correct?
The soft amount, yes.
Yes. And then I just want to reiterate again that this program is looking for new programs and new spend. So any expenses or programs that have been initiated prior to the application would not be covered. Is that correct?
Correct. And you can, and as Alex was going through the application there, you can see that the application was built and constructed in that regard, and with that intent in mind, is that give us information on your new program, give us your budgeting for your new program going forward.
And then finally, I just again want to speak to the end date of this spend. There is the need to obligate the funds by December of 2024 and to fully spend the funds by the end of 2026. But because Lake County has an extreme desire to ensure that we've utilized all of the funds any of our external applicants would be subject to a check-in halfway through the year in 2024 to ensure that we are on target to meet the spend as it was outlined in their program submissions. So it is very, very important to Lake County to maximize the use of these funds, and therefore it's critical for us to have a very close monitoring on these external projects to ensure that the funds will actually be utilized within the time frame. Otherwise, we would have the ability to kind of redeploy those to other projects that ensure that we're able to utilize all of the funds. Just a follow-up question on procurement. You know, is it possible to use joint procurement contracts?
Yes.
Yes. And then how about a substantial expansion of a current program?
It's really hard to say. My best recommendation, and I'll defer to you and Matt, is submit the application. Because based on the information, it could make sense to do so, or it might not.
If there's a need, if there's a documented need and the current program is not meeting that need, I would say let's submit the application and say that, and you'll be able to document why the expansion is necessary due to the pandemic.
So again, I think there is some confusion about the fact that projects seem to fall into more than one expenditure category within these broader categories. And I think there's some confusion about whether you have to break up your project into several different applications. Can you just speak to that again a little bit, Alex?
Certainly, yeah. So my recommendation would be to select the expenditure category that you feel is the best fit. And then and my expectation is certainly not that all of you will become final rule experts overnight. And if there is another expenditure category for which it is a better fit, then what I've done in the past is recategorize it as necessary. Because again, this is as much for us to understand how you view your project as it is meeting a Treasury requirement initially. But again, it should fit into one. And then as far as different tasks within a single project, if it is indeed a single use of funds, and by that I mean it is performing a function to serve a single group of beneficiaries, I would say that you can safely categorize it with one expenditure category. However, if you are, I'm having trouble thinking of an example right now, but if the project is truly so large in scope that you feel as if it has to go into separate expenditure categories because it is serving different groups of beneficiaries, then you would need to break it up.
Yeah.
But again, oh, sorry, go ahead, Patrice.
I was just going to say that, you know, this is required only because we report this information to the U.S. Treasury in a very specified format, and it is broken out by those expenditure categories. So this isn't a requirement that we're putting on the program, but rather how we have to report it to the U.S. Treasury. So our quarterly reporting is in that format, and that's why we're seeking applications that apply to only one expenditure category at a time. I do want to just hop back to the question on whether people can partner to do a submission together.
Yes, partnerships are not an issue, but there does need to be a single organization on that application. And then that relationship needs to be defined as, you know, either that partner organization is a subrecipient or working as a contractor. And so, because again, this information does have to be transmitted to Treasury in a very specific format. And so yeah, I think the best thing might just be to submit an application and we can, you know, negotiate the best way going forward.
Yep, I totally agree. We do want to encourage as many applications as possible. There was a question as to whether, if a minimum of $5 million is required, should they even bother with an application?
A minimum of $5 million?
Million. 5 million. Meaning that is a substantial chunk of the $10 million that we have sort of in an informal way allocated to this program.
I would not want to discourage
exactly
the application. So I would say if it's a minimum of $5 million and it's a program that meets the criteria and the eligibility requirements of the Treasury guidance, that should be submitted.
Is there any restriction on the number of applications that an applicant can submit?
No, that hits at that category question and discussion we were just having, and that if they have a program or programs that are fall in different categories and they have to submit more than one project that meets the criteria, then they should submit.
Is it possible to include links and or attachments to the application?
Yes.
Yeah, we're looking for as much information as possible. So we encourage that actually. And then finally, are you willing to share the scoring matrix on how the applications are going to be scored?
So I can, and I think ultimately we'll take some additional questions that we have in here and maybe do like a frequently asked questions document that we can post on the website. And I presented that criteria and the weights at a previous ARPA committee meeting with the county's COVID-19 recovery committee. So that is out there. There was a presentation that was provided on that already. So I'll recycle that slide and present that.
Awesome. I think if one of the two of you could maybe just summarize with the application due dates again, so that everyone knows what that initial deadline is, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
I think there was a little conflict there with respect to what's on the website and what was in the presentation. We will give everybody until October 31st of this year, obviously, to submit. So that Monday, October 31st, will be the end of day, will be the deadline, 5 o'clock Central Standard Time. And there was one question on, can we set up a time to meet with staff and go over a project? I think just based on the amount of questions that we're getting in our email box, I would suggest that you give us some of those details in an email first and see if we can kind of walk through it in an email. And if we need to follow up with an in-person meeting, we can set that up. But I think county staff at this point is considering just the emails at this point. And we have gotten some requests to try and meet, but that will be the response that we provide initially, at least. But it's not that we want to dissuade anybody or that we don't want to meet and go over your program. It's just based on the amount of requests that we're getting, that we're just going to try and work it out via email if we can.
All right.
Good, Alex.
Yes. Yeah. So I just want to say thank you to everyone that came by. We had a lot of people attend this, which is awesome, like truly awesome. So thank you to everyone that swung by and spent some time with us this morning. We know we didn't get to every question, but I know we answered a lot. But if we did not answer your question, or if you have any additional questions, make sure to email us at that ARPA email address that I put in the chat a couple times. Make sure to shoot us an email there. Like Matt mentioned, we're going to put together some frequently asked questions from this webinar. And so we're going to put together a document that we'll post on our website. And I'm going to post a link here right now. And it's basically, this is our webpage. You probably are all familiar with it now, but I'll post the recording and we'll post the frequently asked questions and all that stuff right there, so you guys can reference that back too. So it'll typically take us a day or two. The frequently asked questions might take us a couple days to get all those together and get all the answers, but we'll try our best to get that up as soon as possible. So once again, I just want to thank everyone for stopping by. Thank you to Bronner for coming and giving this great information. Patrice and Matt, you did a great job. And till next time, everyone, thank you and have a good day.